I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think a lot of us in the room are familiar with PG&E, one of the largest utilities in the United States, the largest investor in utility here in California. The company in recent years faced a lot of challenges as it relates to wildfire, trying to reduce ignitions and dealing with the very stark reality of a changing climate here in this region. And I'd love to just start off by talking a little bit about what PG&E has been able to do in that regard in reducing wildfire risk.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and Katherine, glad to be in conversation with you. Thank you again for your important book, California Burning. I think you lay out very well the history that got us here, and happy to speak about what we've been doing since. So we've been working very hard to address wildfire risk and climate change risk in general. In the last few years, we've been able to reduce wildfire risk on our system by over 90%. And it's been a combination of efforts. First and foremost, it's been about situational awareness, making sure that we understand the service area, that we've got eyes on it. So we've established the largest and extensive weather metering system within our service area, as well as high definition cameras, so that we're able to both predict fire conditions, but also be able to identify when wildfires start and when there's ignitions. So we have that first layer of protection and situational awareness. Then we move on to system hardening, so advancements in new poles, covered conductor, and now our efforts around undergrounding. And then also having operational controls, being able to shut off the power when we think the system is at high risk. And what's been interesting as we've deployed these different tools and technologies is how innovation has continued to refine and make the process better. So we started off with cameras, but now we have AI-enabled cameras that we've been deploying. And so these cameras are able to detect smoke different from a cloud. And actually our fire department, the Cal Fire, relies on these cameras now in order to help them detect when there's a fire before waiting for someone to call in. Similarly, as we've invested in undergrounding and covered conductor, we've made innovations that allowed us to do these faster and cheaper. And then finally, one of the things we've been trying to manage are some of the outages associated when we have to shut off the power. A few years ago, when we started to shut off the power in high-risk conditions, we'd have many customers out power, sometimes for days. We've really been able to refine that and to limit our shutoffs to a much more narrow location, and introducing other technologies, like we just started piloting a technology last year called GridScope, which allows for a sensor on 2 different poles. So you're actually able to narrow in on one segment of a line where you're going to have a disturbance even before an outage. This allows us to have faster response. So you take those traditional methodologies and technology and innovations, helping us just refine them and do it at a lower cost.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So in thinking about wildfire risk and climate change, really the big challenge here in Northern California has that been several periods of very severe drought over the last decade or so has made it so that the consequence of infrastructure failure became much higher, right? A single spark settling in dry brush with billions of dead trees throughout the service territory created this really existential risk for PG&E. And as I understand it, PG&E has been also working to understand other climate risks. What's that effort been looking like?
All right, so as you pointed out, wildfire risk is just one of the climate risks that we'll experience in California. And so we submitted to our policymakers back in May a climate vulnerability assessment where we assessed all of our assets and the vulnerability to different climate risks over a 10 to 50-year period. And so we're going to experience in California not just wildfire risk, but high heat, flooding, subsidence, droughts, all in combination. And what we learned from wildfire is that you can address a risk, but the longer time you have to plan ahead, the better you can do it and at a lower cost. So now we're using that assessment to help us make investments that not only address one risk, but can address multiple risks. So for example, when undergrounding a wire, you can address wildfire risk. It also can help with extreme storms, like the storms we experienced earlier in the year. So having that time to plan, as well as to make sure that we're building our new equipment to standards that are resilient to what the conditions will be in 40 to 50 years, is how we're working to get ahead so that our communities are safe from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think you can't come to a conference like this, certainly these days, without talking about what could be really substantial increase in power demand, right? Whether that's tied to AI or electrification, the deployment of EVs. How is PG&E assessing the need for upgrades to support this burgeoning demand? And has there been any innovative technology that could help manage that?
Yeah, so in order to reach the state's decarbonization goals as well as ours, we know that electricity demand will increase substantially. And so how do we, again, prepare for that and prepare for that demand while building the system to be resilient? So there's a couple of things we're doing to do that affordably. One is better utilization of existing capacity. Our existing grid is utilized about 50% because a lot of it was built for peak. So the more that we can shift usage from peak times to other times of the day where we can take advantage of the solar and wind and storage that we have, that's going to be greater utilization of the grid we have as we plan out to further build. And then there's also a lot of smart technologies that allow, for example, for EVs to be connected, but to use software to optimize the load. So not all load has to happen on demand. And so working in partnership with customers has been really key.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that is I think, pretty pressing challenge for PG&E, and not just PG&E, a lot of utility companies right now, is just how to manage affordability in the context of making these really big investments, whether it's climate related or capacity related. And that's really been front and center in California for a while now. How are those conversations going and internally in terms of how to manage that pressure?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, affordability is top of mind for us, as we know it is for our customers, because we have seen significant increases in rates over the last few years. And a key driver of that is actual work being done. Everything we've been talking about, how do you prepare the system? This is a once in a generation, a once in a century level of investment that we need to be making. And we know we want to make it because when you look ahead to 2040, 2050, the grid of the future is actually better. It's lower cost because you're using more efficient energy with electrification. It's cleaner, but how do we get from here to there? So there's a few things that we're doing to help bring bills back in line with inflation. One is just simply doing the work at a lower cost. So using innovations to be able to, for example, do our veg management at a lower cost. We've been able to pull out a lot of cost in our processes as we're re-envisioning the processes as well as bundling work. And innovation doesn't just have to be technology, it can be process as well. An area we've been able to save a significant amount of money in the last couple of years has been on insurance, for example. We adopted a new model for getting insurance, which is coming at a lower cost to our customers. So first of all, it's just doing the work smarter and better. The second way to help manage the cost is to look at what's in the bill and reevaluate, is everything that's in the customer bill, do we really need to have that? We pay through a lot of different programs through the customer bill, so being in conversation with our policymakers about if certain subsidies still need to persist, which programs are going to be most critical for bringing customers online. And then the final thing is, maybe counterintuitive, the more electricity that actually goes on the grid, the lower the average cost for customers. And so we want to attract big beneficial loads like data centers, like EVs, because if we're able to have that load come on, it'll help spread the fixed costs, and that will lower the costs for potential customers. By our estimates, if you add 1,000 megawatts of data center load, that can help put downward pressure of 2 to 3%, 1 to 2% on the average residential customer bill. But again, we've got to make sure that we're attracting that load on places where we can serve it well and timely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Returning to one of the things you brought up earlier as it relates to reducing wildfire risk, PG&E has plans in place either to proactively shut off power when fire risk is high, and certain line settings that could make it so the lines automatically trip off, mm-hmm. right, if something comes into contact. That does create a bit of a challenge with reliability, right? And so there's certainly sort of questions about how long these sorts of mitigations, I suppose, can remain in place, especially as we move more toward electrification. What is the company doing to try to work through that? How do you see that improving?
Sure. So there's a couple of things we've been doing near term just to reduce the amount of time customers have outages. When we first started deploying these operational mitigations, we would have customers who could be out for several hours or longer. We've been able to significantly reduce that time in a couple of ways. One of the things that takes time to restore power is you have to inspect the line. You have to make sure that the danger is no longer there. So we've now been able to deploy drones, for example, to help with line inspection. So that reduces the amount of time. Also, that technology I mentioned, GridScope, it helps to pinpoint exactly where the disturbance or outage is. So again, you're having to patrol a much shorter space. So there's innovations around just reducing the time of outages. But it's also around just investing in equipment that not only reduces wildfire risk, but improves reliability, which is why we are focused on undergrounding our highest risk miles. And this is under 10% of the miles that we have, but when you underground, you end up reducing the wildfire risk, and you also improve reliability because you won't have those outages. So trying to really think holistically about the customer experience. And then finally, there's areas where we've invested in microgrids, because we said, you know what, this is just not a place where you should have lines generally, given the wildfire risk and reliability concerns. And so really, not being afraid to use all the tools in the toolbox.
Yeah, the undergrounding plan is very ambitious, right? The goal is underground 10,000 miles within roughly a decade. Is that right, more or less? It was really an interesting discussion at the regulatory level over the last couple of years about this notion that, I mean, undergrounding a mile of wire is relatively expensive, but the company argues that it's the best means of reducing risk and cost over time because you're saving on veg management and other maintenance things, right? I mean, how's it going in terms of driving down the costs enough to really achieve this goal?
Well, it's going well. I mean, I think one of the things that people in technology space can appreciate, when you do something at scale, that has the opportunity to lower costs. And the reason we wanted to do a 10-year undergrounding plan is so that we can make commitments with our suppliers, with our communities, around permits, around supply, to actually help drive down the cost. And so we were authorized to do a set of miles over the last couple of years. We've been coming in both on time and under budget, which is, I'm really proud to say that, because that's not something you always hear from a big company or utility. And we've also been seeing innovations to help lower the cost. I mean, when I first heard about undergrounding, 10 years ago, the cost was almost twice as much. And so it's simple things. Like, one of the first innovations we were super excited about was we recognized that you didn't have to dig the holes, the trenches, as deep as we were digging them, that you could dig them 6 inches shorter, and we were seeing that in other applications. Well, when you dig up dirt, there's a cost to that. There's spoils. You have to transport it. You have to move it. You have to clean it. And so that saved, several $1 million. And so it's a series of small innovations, but also big ones that, in coming together, can help to lower costs. But I mean, I would just say, what is the cost of inaction? I mean, we have witnessed the cost of not having the right equipment in place, and we don't want to have that experience for our customers. And so I'm glad there's a conversation happening, because there's a broader conversation that does need to happen around how are we as a society going to pay for and address climate risk.
And maybe one of the last questions to ask, especially given the audience, is what sort of interest has PG&E seen from clean tech companies, climate tech companies, especially those here in the Bay? Any particularly interesting prospects?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of interest, and one of the things that we did last year is that we had our first innovation summit, where we put out a report that had 70 research problems. Like, here are the things that as a utility we need help innovating. And that's really sending a clear signal out there to innovators. And so we got a tremendous response from that. We've been working with a set of companies from that process to really engaging meaningful projects, because sometimes it can be death by pilots with utilities, and we really want to make sure that we are an engaged partner. We also are a funder of an X Prize for Wildfire, which has 2 different challenges. It's about using autonomous technology for both detect fire from outer space, as well as be able to fight fire in a certain amount of time. And so those efforts are still progressing. And so I think when you clarify the problem, it's amazing the technologies and the innovators who come forward.
And I think it probably goes without saying that, like, wildfire risk is not just a California problem. We have seen utilities across the West grapple with this in recent years, and even utilities not in the West. I mean, think about Canada, Minnesota, other places.
Louisiana.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what sort of conversations has PG&E been able to have with other utilities who are trying to begin to get a handle on this?
I mean, many. I would say utilities from across not just the country, but the world have been coming to visit us in California to see our operations center, our wildfire center, and to learn from us. And we're very humble about it. Look, this is a day-by-day journey. We have a stand that catastrophic wildfires will stop, and we've made progress, but we know that we have to stay ahead of where conditions are going. And so we are happy to share with others what we are learning and to learn from them as well. And the big message we're trying to get out there is you can't just think about wildfire risk. That's the one that you're experiencing now, but you really have to do a full assessment to look at all these risks. Even as we're working to mitigate climate change, we've got to also adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.